Hello everyone, this is the Professor Z, and welcome back to yet another Overlord Season 4 episode review. I know that this is yet another late video, but this week was a bit of a troublesome one, and I couldn't find the energy to sit down and record for this video. But, like clockwork, there is plenty to talk about in this video, so let's dive right into it. So we actually start off with an anime-only moment, and I can tell you exactly why this anime moment is here. Firstly, it gives the viewers an idea as to what Ainz is thinking, which in the light novels is a constant source of narration, while in the anime it is far less prevalent, at least when compared to the light novel. Now what Ainz is saying breaks down like this. First is that Ainz doesn't really have a choice but to go along with the whole world domination thing. This is due to him not having an alternative plan, and because they still haven't found Shaltyr's assailant yet. However, just because he can't change course doesn't mean Ainz wants to relinquish control. So instead, he plans on taking the first steps in applying his own plans, those being the Utopia and Adventurers Guild projects, which is what leads him to advertise them himself without outside assistance. This leads into the introduction of the carrot and stick plan. I would imagine that to many that this line would have been of little importance, but it is something that will gain relevance as the story progresses. But pretty much for Ainz, carrot and stick boils down to gifting prosperity to those who follow him and punishing those who don't. Moving on from this scene, we find Ainz and Ainzach riding through the Imperial capital. As Ainz gazes out the window, he's actually contemplating the differences between the Sorcerer's Kingdom and the Empire, in terms of their population energy levels. You see, while the people of the Empire are out and about going about their daily lives, the people of the Sorcerer's Kingdom live in a constant state of fear due to Ainz's presence. Ainz, however, pins his citizens' low morale on the fact that they had just been conquered, and that over time, they would adjust. Ainzach then deduces where they had ended up, and naturally voices his concerns. Ainz giving the excuse that due to his positive relationship with the Emperor, that everything would be okay. This flimsy excuse wins out in the end, but in reality, Ainz just doesn't want Zherkaniv to put out the red carpet for him, since Ainz doesn't exactly have the most experience in noble society. Now, some may be wondering why Ainz chose Ainzach as his accomplice for this endeavor. Well, despite Ainz having previously been an adventurer, he rose through the ranks so fast that he never truly melded into the lifestyle. Thus, by bringing Ainzach along, a seasoned adventurer, Ainz has someone who can relate to those he wishes to recruit. Something quick to note is that this little guy right here is a Hanzo. A Hanzo is a humanoid ninja-type monster, adept at dealing with stealth, who was summoned via the use of items and gold from Nazarick. You know, that's something that I don't believe is actually ever explored in the anime. Well, within Nazarick is a library that contains a myriad of books. Everything from classic literature to class-changing relics can be found within. And though these resources are not unlimited, the members of the guild Ainzulgon gathered a borderline absurd amount of various summoning items during their time. Ainzach then infers as to what Ainz's goal is for entering the Empire, in which he explains his goal to invite adventurers from the Empire to join his new guild. In return, Ainz gets something he's been dreaming of since he got here, and that's someone who disagrees with his plans. Since the moment the NPCs came to life, they have treated Ainz's every word as fact, so to have someone actually give constructive criticism to his plan is liberating to Ainz. However, Ainz can't just accept criticism since it contradicts his all-knowing Lord of Nazarick persona, so he plays the "I'm undead and thus don't think as humans do" card. This further draws Ainzach into Ainz's plans, as he as a ruler has personally asked Ainzach for help with such human-related matters in the future. Ainzach then brings up the idea of enticing adventurers-to-be into joining the Sorcerer's Kingdom. And what better way to advertise oneself than by showing your strength within the arena? We then cut to a very large estate, which belongs to one of the most powerful promoters of the arena. Now, Ainzach is acquainted with this person because he had previously captured undead from the Katsei Plains in order for them to fight in the arena. It's here in the light novels where we learn a bit about the Overlord family of monsters, as Ainz explains to Ainzach the difference between himself and other undead. There are three types of Overlord: the Overlord Wise Man, who is adept at magic, the Overlord Chronos Mage, which focuses on time-related abilities, and the Overlord General, who is adept at undead leadership, even the weakest of these being around level 80. To put it simply, if another overlord with evil intentions appeared in this world, most of the surrounding nations would probably crumble. Einzach then goes out in order to set up an appointment, which wouldn't end up being until the next day. Now Ainz could easily throw his weight around and get a sooner appointment, but to Suzuki Satoryu, that would be impolite. Though this may make him seem foolish in the eyes of other nobles, to Einzach it makes Ainz out to be an even greater ruler. Quick note. Einzach didn't use Ainz's name when making the appointment because he didn't want to cause a commotion from breaking out, since most people still view Ainz as a monster. After Einzach sets up the appointment, Ainz teleports him back to Irantel. After sending Einzach off, Ainz goes to meet with Fluter. Now Ainz promised Fluter that he would teach him magic in return for his servitude. The problem with this is that the way the people of this world learn magic and how Ainz does are very different, so Ainz has essentially made a promise that he can't keep. However, instead of teaching him directly, Ainz chooses to give Fluter an old tome. Funny enough, Ainz actually has no idea what that book contains. He merely skimmed it and saw that it had something to do with magic, so yeah, Ainz's training for Fluter is merely him buying time for himself. Now, there are two moments here that are slightly altered compared to the light novel. The first is when Fluter tells Ainz that his treachery had been found out. In the anime, Ainz merely says that he'd take it into consideration. But in the light novel, the course of events is slightly different. In the light novel, Ainz initially decides to take Fluter back to the Sorcerer's Kingdom in order for him to conduct magical research. However, he ends up going back on this idea. Why? Well, for his best friend Jerkniv, of course. Ainz fears that without a strong deterrent like Fluter, that other countries would attack the Empire. Thus, he lets Fluter stay. Now, the second thing changed here is very subtle, and I wouldn't blame other light novel readers for missing it, since I also forgot about it. At the end of this scene, Ainz asks Fluter about the Martial Lord, and that's the end of it. But there's one other thing Ainz asks about in the light novel. He asks about Death Knights. Now, what he asks specifically is never disclosed, but it is interesting that they decided to cut this from the anime. We then move on to the following day, when Ainz and Einzach are being led by a butler and maid to meet with the arena promoter. It is here where Einzach points out the maid isn't human, but is instead a species known as a rabbit man. Einzach mentions that they're probably from the east. To be specific, Einzach is referring to the Far East, well past the city-state alliance. The group then enters a room filled with a variety of weapons, all of which had previously seen use within the arena, all of them besides the sword Ainz would pick up. Ainz would take a special interest in this blade after seeing runes engraved along the blade. For those unaware, runes are an alphabet commonly associated with Vikings and Norse mythology, since various documents from these cultures were inscribed with them. This may explain why you might see them frequently in fantasy games, since early scholars thought that they may have had magical properties, which is carried over to pop culture today. For Ainz, however, this raises the question as to how a language from his world ended up here. The owner of the blade, Ost, would go on to explain that the blade was forged within the Dwarven Kingdom, located within the Azerlesian mountain range. Specifically, the blade was forged by a runesmith named Stonell around 150 years ago. After returning the blade to its stand, Ainz, Einzach, and Ost all take a seat. Einzach then inquires as to how Ost had figured out Ainz's identity. Ost saying that it was simple deduction since he had come with someone who appeared to have been his superior. Now, we have a chunk of cut content here, so strap in. So, if you hadn't already realized, Ost is a fan of weapons, but more specifically, he admires the warriors who wield them. Due to his less than flattering physique, Ost could never be one of those warriors. Thus, he seeks out mementos of said warriors instead. Now, Ost asks Ainz if his strength comes from hundreds of years of study, since the undead have no lifespan. This leaves Ainz to think about what kind of character the Sorcerer's King is. After some contemplation, Ainz decides to play into it, and act like he is indeed hundreds of years old. Why is this relevant? Well, due to this, Ost ends up asking Ainz if he'd be willing to sell any weapons of the past that he may possess. Now, Ainz has an extremely packed inventory, way past what the average player would think logical. So he pulls out a blue crystal blade, which draws the gazes of both Ost and Einzach. Ainz takes note of this and gives the blade to Einzach as a reward for his loyalty. Since the blade is not strong enough to harm him, nor is it anything made by his past friends, Ainz has no problem giving it up. This leads us back into the anime, where Ainz requests his duel with the Martial Lord. Ost, of course, doesn't believe that the current Martial Lord could be beaten. Ost is especially attached to the current Martial Lord since he had personally raised him into the warrior he is today. Ainz assures Ost that no matter what would happen to him during the fight, that Ost would face no repercussions. After accepting this response, and in the light novel receiving a weapon from Ainz's inventory, Ost agrees to have Ainz fight. However, there would be some restrictions. The arena actually forbids the use of flight and teleportation magic. This is due to an instance where a group of adventurers beat the Martial Lord by flying and raining spells on him, which didn't exactly make for an entertaining match. However, the restriction on all of Ainz's magic is a personal request from Ost. You see, Ost's interest for weapons and combat goes past a mere hobby and into a borderline fetish, which is why he craves for Ainz to use only weapons against the warrior he personally created. With Ainz's agreement to these restrictions, the fight is set and Ainz and Ainzach take their leave. Something I forgot, Ainz tells Ost that he can't use his super tier magic for another 10 years. This is a form of information warfare. By throwing this out there, anyone who may have come across this information would be misinformed, and thus would underestimate Ainz. After Ainz's departure, Ost turns to his maid, Headhunter Rabbit, and asks him, yes, they are a male, about what they think of Ainz. Headhunter is actually a hired mercenary who hails from the City-State Alliance. Headhunter then reveals his hands, stating that being in Ainz's presence made him want to flee. This is something Headhunter has only ever said about one other person, that being the current Martial Lord. After getting a peek into Ost's preferences, the scene ends with Headhunter warning of the threat that Ainz possesses. We then cut to Ost and Gogin talking within the prep room inside the arena. Now, this scene is very short in the anime, but as it tends to be, within the light novel, it is significantly longer. What's missing here really is just information about Gogin. Gin was originally a wandering warrior who went through the Empire fighting those who did not surrender to him. Despite his rational nature, the Empire had plans to send Fluter out to dispatch of the monster. Upon hearing of this powerful monster, Ost sought them out in hopes of turning them into his perfect warrior. Ost soon found Gin, who agreed to join forces with him in order to get stronger. Cut back to the present, and the last major thing cut, Ost and Gin have a back and forth about Gin getting married. Specifically, Ost wants to raise Gin's child to be even stronger than Gin is now, and pushes him to consider it. It's not all that important, I just find it funny that they talked about this before a literal life and death match. Before we continue with the anime, there is a small section cut here where Ainz, while waiting for the match, goes over how he knows all about the Martial Lord thanks to Fluter, and has restricted his use of magic items and weapons as a response in order to make the fight more interesting. Finally, we enter into the battle between Ainz and Gogin. I'd have to say that this is the best fight scene in all of Overlord. From the animation to the choreography, this is an extremely well done fight. More of this quality going forward, please. Ainz and Gogin then introduce themselves, and Ainz is surprised that Gogin did not belittle his name, since the war troll he had met previously in Season 2 had done just that. Just as Ainz is different from other undead, so is Gogin different from other trolls, which draws Ainz's admiration. In the light novel, Ainz compares his admiration for Gogin to his admiration for Gassif, and in a complete reverse of their meeting back at the end of Season 3, Gogin does take Ainz's hand and agrees to join him if he loses. However, if Ainz were to lose, Gogin, in accordance with some kind of cultural thing, would get to eat Ainz and in turn gain his strength. Before the fight begins in the light novel though, Ainz makes a point to express that overlords are much stronger than any other undead. This is to plant the seeds of doubt in Gin's mind as to what Ainz is capable of. You see, Ainz believes heavily in information warfare, due to his time in Yggdrasil fighting guilds and other players. The fight then begins in earnest, as Gogin makes the first move, which Ainz easily dodges. Ainz then hears Jerkniv cheer for the Martial Lord. At first, Ainz would find this funny, like a super fan cheering for their favorite football player, but over time, Ainz would begin to find this very annoying, even angering him at points. The next move in the fight would be made by Ainz. Ainz then strikes the end of Gin's club, which due to the vibrations would numb Gin's arm, but not Ainz's since he lacks any bodily functions. Ainz then activates the flames on the end of his staff, which draws Gin's attention long enough for Ainz to touch Gin directly. Now, what Ainz does here is a racial skill of an Overlord. By making direct contact with Gin, not just with his hand, Ainz infuses negative energy into his opponent, as well as inflicting a physical debuff. This has its limits. Ainz can't just drop a foe's stats to 0, but Gin has no way of knowing this. Ainz then explains to Gin the magical item restriction he had placed on himself for this fight, before releasing his staff and taking up 2 stilettos. And yes, these are the same ones used by Clementine back in Season 1. Ainz then sprints towards Gin, activating the skill Despair Aura Level 1 Fear, in order to throw Gin off while Ainz lands a strike. There are 5 levels to this skill. Level 1 is Fear, Level 2 is Panic, Level 3 is Confusion, Level 4 is Insanity, and Level 5 is Instant Death. Though the strike Ainz lands doesn't do much damage, he unleashes the spell held within the stiletto, which is highly effective. Gin, attempting to create some space, swings his club, which pushes Ainz back. Ainz proceeds to ask Gin if he even has a chance in this fight, which he responds that he doesn't. This is a bluff, however, as Gin unleashes various martial arts in a combo attack, sending Ainz flying before sending him back down to earth. The last part of the attack, however, Ainz is able to block with his stilettos. In the anime, Ainz then discusses how the main difference between him and Gin is that Ainz is a level 100, and thus at a base stat level is overall more powerful and has a larger HP pool to boot. While he does this, he walks forward, tanking Gin's hits, and proceeds to apply further debuffs. He finds Gin shedding his armor in hopes of lightening the load, since he's suffering from these debuffs, and since the armor itself does not protect him from said debuffs. Pretty much accepting his defeat, Gin asks Ainz if he's weak. Despite being a menace by this world's standards, when compared to Ainz, Gin is merely a drop in the bucket. Despite knowing this, Gin is happy to know that there's something out there to strive for. This makes Ainz reminisce about his past friends. You see, the members of Ainz Ul-Gon would spar with one another, and despite what you might think, there were various members of the guild that Ainz could not beat. Touch Me-san was specifically one of the people that Ainz spent forever trying to beat, but was never able to. Despite this, it did push Ainz to grow, just as Gin is experiencing right now. Gin then requests that Ainz show him his true power. Ainz accepts this request and activates his high physical damage nullification, a skill that Gin could never imagine breaking through. Walking through Gin's attacks, Ainz stabs Gin with his stiletto and unleashes the acid spell held within, ending Gin and this fight. Ainz then takes out a magic microphone and begins to advertise his new adventurers guild. He even demonstrates his ability to resurrect others via a magic wand by bringing back Gin. Upon finishing his speech, he ascends, using Fly, back to the VIP box where Jerkniv is located. After casually shrugging off Jerkniv's praise, Ainz wishes to get out of there as soon as possible, in order to avoid Jerkniv realizing that he's just a normal guy. However, before Ainz can leave, Jerkniv makes the proposal that the Empire should become a vassal state of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. To put it bluntly, Ainz has no idea what Jerkniv is going on about, and more specifically, is worried about what Albedo and Demiurge would think of such a thing. In order to push this topic off to a later time, Ainz tells Jerkniv that this decision should be put into writing. After Jerkniv agrees to this, Ainz pieces out and we are left with Jerkniv and his knights. So why did Jerkniv suddenly suggest vassalage? Which, for those of you wondering, is pretty much the Empire bending the proverbial knee to the Sorcerer's Kingdom and accepting them as their superiors. For Jerkniv, at this point, there aren't many choices left. His negotiations with the theocracy are down, and he has no way of besting Ainz. So at this point, the best thing to do is to bend the proverbial knee and hope for the best. Jerkniv believes that he's been bested in the battle of intellect as well, while in reality, Ainz just has the dumbest luck to ever grace an anime character. Shout out to Basilwood for hitting it on the head though. The episode then ends with Jerkniv believing himself the unluckiest man alive. It's worse in the light novel though, as the news of vassalage makes Silver Canary leave the Empire as well. So, overall, this was probably the best episode of the season so far. It's actually the end of Volume 10. Except for the epilogue, which will most likely be in the next episode. It goes without saying at this point, but there was a lot of cut content. However, the majority of it wasn't world-warpingly significant, so it's fine in the end. But that's all for today, everyone. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, comment down below about what you thought of this episode, and of course, subscribe for more going forward. And as always everyone, this has been the Professor Z, and I will see you all next time.